Welcome everyone to our volunteer management webinar series in partnership with Recreation Connections. Thank you all for joining us. This is our fourth webinar of the series, and today it's all about volunteer intake. So we'll be talking about applications, interviews, and reference checks. So I'm Camila Elgiata. I'm the youth program coordinator at Volunteer Manitoba. I've been with the organization for about 2 years now. And so I'm excited to be hosting today's webinar. So if you have any questions throughout the webinar or any concerns or you want clarification about anything, please use the group chat function, write them in there, and then when the time is right, we will take those questions. So before we get started, I would like to take a quick second to highlight Volunteer Manitoba's programs and services. So Volunteer Manitoba is the only volunteer center in the province, and for over 40 years, we have connected people with volunteer opportunities, promoted and celebrated volunteerism, and provided leadership and support to the nonprofit and volunteer sectors. As you can see in the bubbles, those are our primary programs and services that we offer. So our community outreach program allows us to connect with individuals and groups and to share information on volunteerism, how to get involved, and to advocate for the nonprofit sector. We can also help people find volunteer opportunities, and we work closely with organizations to help promote positions within their volunteer programs. We also run a program called Board Connect, which helps facilitate matches between boards and individuals who want to serve. So yeah, our volunteer referral program is very much about connecting people to volunteer opportunities. So if anyone does have any volunteer opportunities that they are looking for volunteers or they're looking to recruit volunteers, please connect with us. We'd be happy to connect you to individuals that want to give back to their community. Over the years, we've become known for our training in board governance, volunteer management, and capacity building for groups and individuals. So we have workshops, group training, distance and online courses, and webinars. So VM training is offered in a variety of formats. Our most popular option right now has been virtual and online, but we also have lots of resources and supports available. And if we don't have what you need, we will try and source it out for you. So you can learn more about our training program and our services that we offer on our website. We also have the VM Youth Program, which is the program that I coordinate. So we raise awareness in youth and young adults about the value of volunteerism, and we work with agencies and communities on how to improve youth and engage the next generation. And last but not certainly least, our annual volunteer awards. So this year, the celebration has been postponed to November 18th, 2020. The recipients are listed on our website, and we'll be looking forward to sharing more about them and the incredible work they've done in our communities and in the coming months. So if you want, you can follow us on Facebook or Instagram. We've been highlighting some of our award winners there. They've done incredible work and they deserve to be recognized. And also, if you know someone that deserves to win an award and to be nominated, our award nominations, they normally go up in October, November. Normally in the fall time, we open up nominations, and you can find out about that on our website as well. So without further ado, I am going to introduce Dawn. Dawn is our facilitator today. She is Volunteer Manitoba's Manager of Communications and Outreach. She oversees VM's internal and external communications, manages the website and our social media platforms, and is responsible for increasing awareness of Volunteer Manitoba's mission, which is to encourage and promote volunteerism across the province. She also managed volunteers for festivals and special events in Winnipeg. So Dawn, I think I'm going to pass it over to you now.
Thanks, Camila, and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us for another one of our fabulous webinars on volunteer management best practices. So today we're going to go through one of my sort of favorite parts of volunteer management. This is what I like to call the paperwork portion of our show, but it's volunteer intake. And we're going to talk about the intake process and what that looks like. We'll talk a little bit about screening, picking up on what we talked about 2 webinars ago when we talked about volunteer screening. And then we're going to focus on the 3 elements of intake, which are application forms, interviews, and reference checks. And again, like Camila mentioned, if you have any questions throughout the webinar, throw your question in the chat and we'll take a couple of moments throughout to just pause and answer whatever questions that you have. So before we dive into the application forms, interviews, and reference checks, I thought we'd just take a little step back and talk about screening again and what that means, screening potential volunteers. So for those of you who weren't able to join us for the earlier webinar, and those of you who did, this will be a bit of a refresher, but screening is a process that helps match people with volunteer positions while also improving the quality and safety of the programs and services offered in our communities. So screening is an ongoing 10-step process that's performed by organizations and groups to ensure that volunteers' involvement is meeting the needs of the organization, the populations that they serve, and the volunteers themselves. So in short, screening ensures that the right match is made between the work that needs to be done and the person who's going to do it. Why is it important? Because organizations have a moral, legal, and ethical responsibility to the people they reach. And this includes members of our organizations, clients who access our programs and services, our own employees, and our volunteers. Each volunteer position has its own set of requirements, its own risks and benefits, and screening is especially important for organizations who work with vulnerable people. Determining how and if to engage or retain a volunteer is always the responsibility of the organization. So you need to understand yourselves what the parameters of the job are and how you're going to screen those volunteers. We can offer advice and guidance, but really at the end of the day, you're the ones that are going to determine how best this is going to work for you. We are also calling the onboarding or intaking of volunteers, also includes application forms, interviews, and reference checks. Those are also 3 components of the 10 steps of screening, and they're really important elements in order to make sure that the potential volunteer is going to be the right fit. It's important to think of screening and intake as more than just police record checks. A lot of organizations just default to a background check and they consider that screening a volunteer. I want you to just think that even though it is important, especially when dealing with vulnerable people, it's not the only tool in your toolkit. So our recommendation is always to also include a combination of interviews, application forms, and reference checks, along with any background checks that you're going to be doing. And following the 10 steps of screening is going to help you create a solid process for your intake of volunteers. And you can download the screening handbook from Volunteer Canada's website for free. I use it all the time, and so do many organizations that we work with. So it's a valuable, fantastic resource. I highly recommend checking it out if you're not familiar with it already. The benefits of screening, there's 3 major benefits to screening, among other things. The first is it better matches people's skills and experience with the needs and opportunities within the organization. It also improves the quality and safety of your programs and services within your community, and it reduces the risks and liability for both people and organizations as a whole. The screening of your volunteer lasts for the entire duration of their involvement with your organization. It's not just a short period of time at the beginning. And you are responsible for ensuring that intake and screening standards are in place, that they work for your organization, that they're relevant for each position, and that they're followed and updated as required. So just again, another refreshment, the 10 steps of screening, as I mentioned, Volunteer Canada has this excellent resource that you can download. What's interesting about these steps is that the first 3 steps take place even before you meet a volunteer for the first time. So your assessment, your position assignment, or your job description creation, and then recruiting volunteers, that all happens directly from you. But there are parts of screening in there that you can implement as well. The next 3 steps are what we're going to talk about today, which are applications, interviews, and reference checks. And then we commonly refer to these as intake, as you'll know throughout this webinar. Police checks are also an option if the risk warrants a police check. And then finally, the last 3 steps are happening as the volunteer is already in place working for you. So you can see how these are more of a, you can use these as a cluster of steps rather than following them 1, 2, 3 in order, chronological order, I should say. All right, So now let's get into intake. Intake or onboarding, again, includes application forms, interviews, reference checks, and police background checks if that's warranted. A good intake process will help you mitigate the potential risk and ensure that the volunteer is the right fit for the position. It also lets you know that a volunteer has gone through the process and accepts the mission and the vision of the organization, that they have a value system that is compatible with your organization or your group, and that they will follow the policies and procedures that you've laid out. It's also important to think of screening and intake as more than just police record checks. Oh, we're repeating ourselves a little bit. Sorry about that. Again, following the 10 steps of screening will help you create a solid process for your intake. So, application forms are used to do the initial assessment in order to determine if the potential volunteer meets the minimum requirements for the volunteer position. So for example, are they the minimum age requirement for the position? Some of us only take people who are 18 years or older for various reasons. Some people, those of you who are recruiting youth volunteers, you might have an age cutoff of 16. Some of you might be as low as 14. An application form will have that listed as a requirement of the position. Also, you can list on the application form a schedule so you'll know when people are available. So if people are only available Monday, Wednesday, Friday, they can check those boxes on the application form. If they meet the minimum requirements of the position, then you can proceed to the next step in the intake, which is interviews. And interviews are really an opportunity to gather more insight as to whether or not the person will be a good fit for your organization and for the volunteer position. And if they successfully complete the interview, then you proceed to do the reference checks in order to double check the information that you've gathered about the applicant so far. So we're going to do a quick poll right now. Crane's going to throw a poll up on your screen. And what I'd like you to do is, when you guys are screening volunteers, I'd like you to check off all of the things that you currently do for your intake of volunteers. So if you're only doing application forms, just check that off. If you're doing all three, check all three. If you're doing only interviews, check off interviews, so on. So I'll give you a minute to just complete that poll, and then we'll keep going. And Crane, just let me know when we're ready to go. Oops. We good?
Yeah, I think so. We've got 34 people
Perfect.
now in that polling.
Excellent. All right, so thank you for providing that feedback. Is there any way, Corinne, to just kind of show the results, or is that, there we go, nice. Okay, so this is not surprising to me. Many of us do application forms and interviews, but oftentimes we don't do the third one, which is reference checks. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but the point of this webinar is to just show you how reference checks can benefit your program in the long run if you do choose to do them. So thanks for participating in that, everybody. All right, so now let's drill down into application forms. According to the 10 steps of screening, having a standardized application form is recommended for all volunteer programs. Every volunteer position or assignment should have an application form. Now, I'm just going to pause for a second. The detail captured in your application form is going to be dependent on the type of organization you are. So I know some of you might be a little bit more grassroots, and your application forms might not be 3 or 4 pages long with a lot of detail on them. They might just be sort of a checkpoint for the volunteers so that you're able to manage where you're going to assign them. For those of you coming from, for example, healthcare, sometimes application forms in healthcare can be upwards of 6 to 10 pages because they've got to collect a lot of information and they're doing a bit more screening for the environment that those volunteers are working in. So don't be worried if, as we go through this webinar, I keep referring to very detailed application forms. It doesn't mean your application forms are wrong. I'm just trying to hit all the bases with this. So asking volunteers to complete an application form also signals the seriousness of your organization's commitment to screening and provides a paper trail that will protect both the volunteer and the organization throughout the relationship. The application form collects basic information in order to process the application of the volunteer. It asks questions directly related to the requirements of the position or assignment. It respects human rights legislation. It requests reference information and consent, and it seeks permission to obtain a background check if that is required. If the organization has decided to accept volunteers who have a flagged police record, it's good to have a statement on the application form regarding police records not automatically disqualifying a candidate unless it's related to the position for which they are applying. Having that just opens you up to more potential volunteer applications. And people will also self-screen out when they see how much information is on your application form. So that's why detail is really important. And you can also provide, I've seen some organizations, instead of a lengthy, like I mentioned, 5 or 6 page application form, they might just have an information sheet or a package, a takeaway packet. And this basically provides information on the application process, the organization itself, the program or activity, maybe even a more descriptive job description. And then a potential volunteer can consider whether their own needs and motivations align with the volunteer work being offered. I've even seen some people put all of this information into a simple brochure, have that ready at your reception area. Volunteers who are interested in working for you can take that brochure home with them, read through it, and then if they're interested in applying for the position, there's contact information on what the next steps are. Organizations should check with the Human Rights Commission or Council in their respective province or territory for a list of the types of information that may be sought as part of the selection process. Ensure your application form only asks for information related to the requirements of the position. So questions on matters such as a person's race, their national origin, their religion or sex are prohibited under federal and provincial human rights legislation. So I did mention a couple slides ago that on your application form, you can have people indicate their age. Because that is against human rights legislation, what we recommend organizations do is, instead of please provide your date of birth, which you cannot ask for, or please provide your specific age, you can put a box. So you could say, are you between 14 and 16? Are you between 16 and 18? Are you between 18 and whatever? Or are you 18 and up? However you want to list that, you just have to make it general so people can select a general category rather than give you specific information about their personal, personal information, like their date of birth and things like that. The other exception to asking somebody to identify their sex is if you're running a program. You have to be very careful about this because there aren't a lot of exceptions. And again, we always recommend that you go and familiarize yourself with the human rights legislation. But if you're running, say, a program for at-risk youth, and the at-risk youth are all young boys who you're looking for a peer to lead them in, I don't know, whatever activities you're going to be doing with them. And if you want that leader to be the same sex as the people, or gender as the people that they are leading, then you can list that on the application form. But those are one of the rare exceptions. So you just become familiar with the commission and the legislation. And if you have any questions, you can reach out to us and we'd be happy to help you with that as well. All right. So application forms should provide potential volunteers with a clear understanding of the position, its responsibilities, the qualifications needed, the required skills, and the time commitment. This also allows potential volunteers to make that informed decision about whether or not they want to continue forward. So they'll either self-screen out or they'll move on to the next step. Sometimes I've seen people attach the job description to the application form, or when you get to the next step, interview, you bring the application form that they filled out, a copy of the job description, and you go over both together in the interview. So some other information that you might want to ask on an application form can include, if, a question about whether or not you have experience working with say you're recruiting volunteers for an after-school program, you can ask if there's experience working with children. And then to list, you know, their past work experience on the application form, maybe the last 3 places they worked, just to give you a better sense of what qualifications and skills they're coming to the table with. If people are volunteering to visit clients in their homes or take them to appointments, you know, do they have their own vehicle? Do they have access to a vehicle? Are they comfortable using their own vehicle to drive people to appointments? Those are all questions you can ask on the application form. Sometimes you might even need to ask them for a driver's abstract, which is a copy from Manitoba Public Insurance of their driving record to make sure that they are safe drivers if you're running a program like that. So you can have that option or request on the application form as well. And then also, again, not to sound like a broken record, but if you are working with vulnerable populations, you want to make sure that both on the job description and the application form is a mention of a willingness to have a police or a background check performed or a vulnerable sector check performed before continuing on with the process. All right, so now we're going to get into interviews. Why interview volunteers? Well, we interview volunteers for a number of reasons. We want to make sure that the volunteer is going to be a good fit with the organization. And so we use the interview as a way to gather more information from the volunteer. It's also the first time many of us meet the potential volunteer in person for the first time. And there's a lot more information that you can gather from somebody when you're face-to-face than you can when they fill out a form online or they submit an email application or however that works for you. On top of getting information, we also want to give the volunteer sufficient information to make a decision about volunteering for us. And that decision should be a two-way street. So they have just as much right to say no to our position as we have to say no to them as a potential volunteer, or yes, on the flip side of that. And after we've exchanged this information in an interview, we'll have a better idea about whether or not there's a match between what we're looking for and what the volunteer needs and what their motivations are. I've also, when I've managed volunteers, the interview's given me a better sense of whether or not I have a different position that they'd be better at or more qualified for that maybe they didn't know about when they applied in the first place. So it kind of gives you a little bit more autonomy in your own job as a volunteer manager to help make sure the right person's placed in the right position in order for them to succeed and in order for us as an organization to get the help we need to run our programs and services. A formal interview shows that we take the volunteers' involvement seriously and we want to know more about them. We want to know what motivates them. We want to know why they're interested in volunteering for us. We want to get a sense of how they communicate with other people. It's my favorite way of getting to know somebody for the first time when I'm managing volunteers. It's also really important as you go through the whole process and you want to retain volunteers for the long term. This interview is possibly the first step towards learning as much as you can about your volunteer in order to keep them motivated throughout their relationship with you. So some tips for interviewing volunteers. I want you to think back when you're thinking about volunteer interviews. I want you to think back to when you applied for a job or, you know, maybe the last job you applied for if you've been in it for a while. I want you to remember the interview and also, you know, how nerve-wracking it can be for those of us in an interview. Even though we could be the best qualified candidate for the position, it's still a really intimidating process to be sitting with somebody and you know, interviewing as a candidate for a position. For some people, interviews are very difficult. If they're introverted or shy, people can get tongue-tied. They can also forget what they want to say because remember, it's a stressful situation. Even if it's for a volunteer position, it still brings out our natural fight or flight instincts sometimes. So just remember that sometimes it's hard to show people what we're really like if we're super nervous and anxious about something. So just be patient and think long-term when you're interviewing people. As a volunteer manager, it's important to make the situation as comfortable as possible so that you can put people at ease and really get to know them. It's not a paid position, so my advice would be don't make it as formal as a paid position interview would be. Again, you're going to want to determine that based on, you know, the responsibilities associated with the position and the environment they're going to be working in. So if they're working in healthcare and the volunteer will be working directly with patients and they've got to learn a lot about, you know, privacy and consent and Health Information Act and all of that, then maybe you do want to have a bit more of a formal environment for that interview. But for most of us working in nonprofit, I think it's nice to interview volunteers where or close to where they're going to be working. You know, so if you take them through the office space or the organization space and then bring them to a comfortable setting, an open room, let's say maybe with not a lot of people eavesdropping, but just create the most comfortable environment that you can. If you are doing your interview in person, and I know right now a lot of us probably aren't able to do that, so we're using Zoom, but you want to have the interview in a friendly environment, maybe even in a coffee shop. And remember, if you are on Zoom and you're doing your interview over the phone, or even I haven't heard of anybody doing an interview over email, but I guess it is possible if you really put your mind to it. Just remember that when you're talking, even though nobody's looking at you or nobody can see you, to smile when you talk. I know that sounds kind of silly, but when you smile when you talk, it comes across in your tone of voice and it makes you sound friendlier and more open. You also want to make sure that the potential volunteer has all the basic information about the position, the screening process, and anything else they need to know about, you know, your policies and procedures. So again, like I mentioned before, you can bring a copy of the job description and go through it step by step with the volunteer. And also have your questions ready. They should be the same questions that you ask everyone who applies for the position. You can then document their responses, so then when you compare them, you are making an unbiased assessment of their suitability. You can also refer to your notes if someone challenges your decision later, which unfortunately has happened to me one time, not that often, but one time. And this is also a good risk management process to just have a copy of all of this in the volunteer file. We do recommend, if you can, have at least 2 people conduct the interview. I find it's a lot easier having 2 people because one person can document responses while the other one is talking to the volunteer. But again, if you don't have the capacity to have 2 people conduct the interview, it's fine if you do it on your own. Another thing in the interview is you want to just keep an eye on nonverbal cues and assess, you know, their manner of personal presentation, their style of relating, their communication skills, any nonverbal communication characteristics. And then finally, your interview should be based on the position and should ask questions relevant to assessing the potential volunteer's suitability for that position. You should also ask the right questions so that you understand what tasks are appropriate for the volunteer and if there are any limitations that might influence what tasks the volunteer can undertake. Are there any questions?
So we just had that the one question about 2 people conducting an interview.
Okay.
It's costly for an organization with limited resources. Is this often done?
Yeah, so as I mentioned, if you can have 2 people, great. If you can't, that's okay too. I just think it's easier to establish a relationship with the potential volunteer when you can focus on them 100% and have somebody else document the responses. If you have that kind of, basically, if you have a process in place that states that all interviews have to have documented responses and those responses need to be stored in the volunteer file for X amount of time, it's easier to have 2 people do that. If you can't, if you don't have the capacity though, I mean, I've also asked volunteers if I could record the interview. And then that way I can capture my notes later and just focus on them. But you do have to remember to ask them permission before you record them, because that won't go over well if they don't know you're recording them. Does that help answer that question?
I believe it does. Diane wrote,
Perfect.
yeah, no, it was good.
Okay, great. Are there any other questions about this interview?
Dawn, we actually have 2 more questions.
That's okay. Yeah, go ahead. That's what I'm here for.
So we've got another question from Diane. How long should volunteer records be kept? So the records that you were talking about, like if you do need to keep records of that interview, how long should they be kept?
So your volunteer records should be kept for the duration of the volunteer's relationship with you. So if I volunteer for you for, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years, you should have all of this in a file in my name for the entire 3 to 4 years. If somebody leaves the organization, even if you think they're going to come back, say they just need a break and they're going to come back a year from now, I would keep their record on file for, I've done it for a year or 2 after they've left. But it really all depends on you. I mean, some people keep former volunteer records for 6 months to a year. Some people keep them as long as they keep their tax files, which is 7 years. It really just depends. I think that if your organization, again, if the volunteer role is very intricate and there was a lot of process in the intake process, like they had to fill out a lot of forms, they, you know, if you did a lot of evaluation throughout their time with you and you have notes on, you know, even things that don't go well, you know, if you had to discipline them for anything or if you had to let them go for any reason, I would keep those files for longer than I would if, say, Camila just joined me for the summer. I keep her file on board for that summer while she's with me. She leaves to go back to school in September. I keep her file for another 6 months and then I shred it. And if she comes back the next summer, we start the process over again. And that's how I manage it. But really what works for you is fine. You know, if you found that you've been keeping your records for only 6 months and then shredding them, that's okay.
That actually leads us to another question, Dawn, from Barb. And she asked, would you interview a past volunteer each time you need a volunteer? And I know you just touched based on that. So
yeah, that's actually a good question because, again, you're going to be doing intake till the cows come home. If you keep doing it over and over and over again, you're also going to know your volunteers at that point. So what I've done with returning volunteers, and again, I'm going to pick on Camila and use her as an example. So if she's a student volunteer of mine over the summer, I've gotten to know her. I did the initial intake process. She's been screened. We've checked her records. All of it's good. She's fabulous. We love her. She just goes back to school in September. No big deal. What I might do when she leaves at the end of summer is say, do you think this is a position you'd be interested in returning to next summer? And if she says, oh yeah, you know, that might not be a bad thing for me, I really like to hear, then I would just keep her file. I wouldn't shred it at all. If I wasn't sure she was going to come back, or say she came back 2 summers later, what I would do is I would still go through the application form again, because stuff changes and you never know. She could have gained more experience in the 2 years she wasn't with me that I don't know about because I interviewed her before that, right? Mm-hmm. So you can do kind of a quick and short version of your intake process for returning volunteers, and you can kind of, what's the word I'm thinking of? You can sort of make it fit what you need. You're also going to know your volunteers better than I will right now teaching this webinar, right? So, I mean, Barb, I'm assuming that you've known a lot of the people in your community for a long time, and when they're volunteering for you, you know, you still have that connection with them even when they're no longer volunteering for you. So if going through the whole intake process verbatim is too much and you don't have the capacity for that and the volunteers returning, the only thing I would really be careful about and just make sure that it's working for your organization is if they've gone away for a certain length of time, but your position requires police record check. You might want to have a policy in place at your organization that talks about, you know, everyone's record check has to be redone after a year, whether you're with us or not, or something like that. Or if you leave, when you come back, you'll have to do the record check again. So you can have all of that you can have that written out, or you can have that provided to the volunteers so that they know if they leave what the process is when they come back. Does that help?
Yeah, no, I think that is.
Perfect.
We do have one more question from
Okay.
Mary.
Yeah, no problem. We got time.
Perfect, from BBB Foundation.
Hi,
She
Mary.
Yeah. She asks, can you give us like us an idea or specific details outlining the screening process? So maybe we can touch base on the screening handbook.
Yeah, you know what I'll do is, Mary, what I'll do is I'm going to save that for the end because there's 10 steps to that process. So we might end up going through that instead of the rest of the webinar. And what I do recommend though is go to Volunteer Canada's website and download the handbook and read through it. It's actually written very clearly and it's easy to follow. And all 10 steps are laid out and then they're explored in more detail in that book. So that's a fantastic resource for everyone. We do have workshops on screening volunteers and the 10 steps. So there might be one of those coming up in the fall as well. So keep an eye on our training calendar. What I'm going to do is, oh, sorry, Camilla, yeah, go ahead.
I just put the link to the handbook in the group chat if anyone
Oh,
wants.
perfect. So there, now you guys don't even have to go surfing for it. We found it for you. Perfect. So what I'm going to do is just keep going. I'm going to wrap up interviews with some example interview questions for you guys. These are some examples of interview questions that you can use. So these questions give you insight into the interests and motivations the potential volunteers coming to the table with. And again, like I've mentioned before, if the role is more complex, in addition to these questions, you're probably going to have more examples of how they demonstrated the skills you need for the position, more behavioral questions where you can pull out a little bit more of how would you deal with this, or give me an example of, or have you ever had this happen and how did you deal with it? One of the examples that we have here is if somebody's going to be working with kids in an after-school program, you might want to ask them about a time that there was conflict with a bunch of young people they work with and how did they resolve it. And then they can share that with everybody else because that's always a very complicated situation, trying to get kids to listen and cooperate. You can also ask them how they would include introverted children into their group exercises, not just the extroverted kids, or how they might have dealt with bullying in the past, you know, things like that related to the position. Also, on top of the interview, you also want to consider reference checks. And I know that's something that many, many organizations don't do. Again, the application form, the job description, recruitment, interviews, and then ongoing supervision could be enough screening for your organization. You might have decided that the role isn't that complex, so we don't need to do reference checks. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you don't have the capacity to do them, and you've decided that they're not directly related to the position, you know, if you're having somebody come in on Sundays to put out cookies and make coffee for meetings or things like that, you know, I don't know how many reference checks you'd have to do for that. I think you could probably get a really good sense of whether somebody's into that position through an interview, but I'll leave that up to you. Just know that talking to individuals who know the potential volunteer can also go a long way towards helping you understand whether or not they're going to fit within your organization. It's also a good way to double check the information that you've been provided by the potential volunteer and make sure that everything is the way you understood it, not just the way it was presented to you. Aside from verifying the accuracy of the information provided by the volunteer, checking references also gives you a host of other valuable insights. Sometimes talking with somebody who has worked with the volunteer will hopefully not only yield a positive endorsement, but it will help you get to know the volunteer's strengths and weaknesses before assigning them to particular tasks. So here are some tips to make the most out of your volunteer references. They're very similar to the tips for conducting an interview with I'm getting tongue-tied, with the potential volunteer. You're going to start by introducing yourself and the organization. I always find when people ask me to provide a reference that it helps me if I can see a job description, because then I know, you know, again, I'll pick on Camila. If she wants me to give a reference for her, I need to know what the job she's applying for, because I don't know if she's going to fit the skills and qualifications of that job if I don't see a description of it. I also might not be familiar with your organization. You know, I might have heard of, you know, the sector that you work in, but I might not know much about the organization itself. So it would help to give a short introduction about that. You can also tell the person who is providing the reference who gave you their name. So the potential volunteer is the one who shared your contact info with me, and I just want to follow up and see if this is going to be a successful match. It's good to let the person providing the reference know what the responsibilities are, what type of clients or participants the volunteer will be interacting with, and any vulnerabilities that the participants have, and outline the qualifications that you require. This will help the person giving the reference provide you with the information you need to make a good decision. And ask open-ended questions so the reference can expand and share information that they feel is important. And then you just want to make sure that you record your responses. I'm saying here always check more than one reference, but I know that most people only check the first reference. So again, I'm not going to point any fingers or tell you that you're wrong. What works for you is going to work for you. If you're not doing any reference checks, what you might want to try, I know it might seem like a lot of work, but if you even just email potential references a list of questions and have them answer them on their own and then send that back to you, that saves a lot of time on the admin side for you. And then it also lets the reference provide that information on their own time. So if I get a call at work and somebody says, do you have 15 minutes to provide a reference? I might not, but I do want to provide that reference, right? So when I get an email saying, hey, can you provide a reference for Camila? Here's 6 questions we need you to ask or answer. That's a lot easier for me to really expand on and give you a better answer than if you catch me in the middle of my workday and I'm in the middle of 6 other things to do. So that might work for you, just as a little tip. These questions can be used in a variety of methods. So like I mentioned, you can send them by email, you can phone people, you can mail them out through the snail mail if you really want to. And anybody can complete a reference for a volunteer. So it could be a professional reference, it could be a friend or fellow volunteer, so somebody they volunteered with at another organization, even family. For volunteer positions, family and personal references are acceptable, like more so than they are for an employment position. But it's nice to have a variety of references. The reason why we say family and personal references are acceptable is there's a lot of newcomers who volunteer and they might not have professional references yet. They're volunteering in order to build those professional references. So they might have a personal or a family reference that they can provide you. And I think that's acceptable. Again, you're going to want to look at the position you're recruiting for, decide the level of screening that you need to apply to it, and then carry on from there. You should conduct references during the initial intake process. And like I mentioned before, when we were talking about if a volunteer leaves and comes back, you can ask for another set of reference checks, that were different from the initial reference checks in order to cover the 2-year period. So for example, when I mentioned if Camila went away and came back 2 years later, I might do a mini interview just to see what she's been up to for the last 2 years. And then I might say, provide me with 1 reference or 2, maybe not all 3, of somebody who you worked with in the last 2 years. So it's sort of building on your initial interview and reference checks with her, but not repeating it. So you're not going back and starting from scratch. All right, so we have another poll that Kareem's going to throw up on the screen for you. And this is just, I want you to select all that apply when it comes to reference checks. So if you're not contacting references, you can click on that. If you're recording the answer, if you're checking more than one, or if you're asking open-ended questions. So I'll just give you a minute, answer that, and then we'll wrap up. So Kareem, just give me a heads up when the poll closes.
We've got 79%. Should we call it?
Answers, please.
All right.
Should have a drum roll. Don't contact, ask open-ended. I record the answers, check more than reference. Nice. So most people are asking open-ended questions. And again, we already know that a lot of people aren't contacting references. And there's no judgment there. There's nothing wrong with that. So yeah, that's fantastic. Thanks everybody for participating in that. So I just want to close off with a couple of other things. These are some important resources to review when you're developing your intake process. Privacy Commissioner of Canada is a good one. You also want to go look at Manitoba's privacy laws as well, which I believe you can access through the province's website. Probably just do a search for privacy. But this will give you an idea of what you can and cannot ask people. The Ombudsman here in Manitoba also has links to the Personal Health and Information Act legislation and FIPA. And then finally, the Human Rights Commission here in Manitoba. Every province has their own Human Rights Commission. This is an independent agency of the government of Manitoba, and it's responsible for administering the Human Rights Code, which protects individuals and groups from discrimination. That's a good thing to inform yourself about and get up to speed on, so you know what you can and cannot ask people when you're bringing them on to your organization. All right, so to wrap up, let me just leave you with a reminder that, you know, as an organization, it is your responsibility to ensure that the right person is delivering your programs and services, and that's why we've created processes behind volunteer management. You also have a responsibility to your current volunteers to set them up for success and a positive experience. You do all of this by having a solid screening process in place so that you have the information you need to choose the right volunteer. And then from the volunteer's perspective, you've given them everything they need to know to make the right decision to volunteer for you. There are 10 steps to the screening process, and we've shared that link in the chat with you. So are there any questions?
Yeah, so we have actually one question. Well, it's two questions in one. So what about, this is kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, or not opposite end, but opposite of interviews, but what if, reference checks, what about when volunteers use you as a reference and don't ask you? Or if they've asked you, but they were not a strong volunteer, what is the suggestion, like what would you suggest doing or saying in these kind of
That's a good one. Okay, so first of all, when it comes to providing a reference and no one's asked, there's no playbook on this. There's nothing we can point to and say, you know, you're wrong or you're right. It's just something that over time I've adopted for myself. I don't provide a reference if you haven't asked me for one. So if an organization or an employer calls me out of the blue and says, do you want to provide a reference for Camila? If Camila hasn't told me about it, sorry, Camila, I'm totally picking on you today. But if Camila hasn't told me about it, this is an opportunity for her to learn that that's not a professional way of going about things. What I would say to the organization is, you know what, I wasn't aware that I was going to provide a reference. If you don't mind, I'd like some time to check back with that volunteer or that applicant to just find out a little bit more before I provide them a reference. And again, I would do that if it's somebody like Camila that I know and like and respect, and maybe she just forgot that that's the best practice. If it's somebody that's more of a stranger to me and I don't know them very well, they were a volunteer who was only with me for a short period of time and then they left, I would probably lean more towards, you know what, I wasn't aware that you needed a reference. And then again, I don't want to throw anybody under the bus. There can be lots of reasons. Maybe it went in my spam, the request for a reference, who knows? So I always like to give people a bit of the benefit of the doubt and say, you know, if you don't mind giving me a day to just check in with the applicant, and then I'll get back to you with my reference. And then the second half to that question is negative references and how do you go about doing that? So I haven't had to do this for a volunteer of mine, but I've had to do this for former employees. I know that I've heard rumors from people that you're not allowed to provide negative references. That is a myth. If that were the case, all of us would just get perfect references all the time, or we wouldn't have any. What you can't do is share private information in a reference. So you have to be careful that when you're sharing information about how somebody performed for your organization, that you're not painting a picture that's not based in fact. So I always kind of, when I'm doing references, if they're negative, what I will do is, rather than get into the details about why it's negative, because I don't know, it might not have worked out at my organization, but it could work out at yours, I will just stick to the facts. So my references will be short, sweet, and to the point. Yes, they volunteered during this time And this time they left before the completion of their project, or they left before the time period we agreed on, and I have nothing else to add to this reference. Most people get good references. Most of us provide good references. It's not often that we do the negative referencing. If I don't have anything nice to say, I probably won't say anything at all. That's kind of my motto in life too. But you'll have to figure that out for yourself, because everybody's going to be different, right? And you're going to know your volunteers differently. So again, Corrine could be a fabulous volunteer for me, and I'd give her a super positive reference. Camila, it just might not have worked out, but she's still a fabulous person. So that might mean she's fabulous at your organization. So you just want to be careful when you're providing your own reference checks, what your own baseline is. And that's usually that's what I do myself. Does that help?
No, that was excellent answer, Dawn. To
okay.
add to that, we actually just got a second question about this. Would you need to inform the candidate that you wouldn't be giving them a positive reference when they ask you to be a reference, so the candidate can make an informed choice if they want to use you or not as a reference?
Again, I would leave that up to you. There might be circumstances where you would do that. There might be circumstances where you wouldn't. I've had a volunteer, for example, I have had to fire a volunteer in the past for theft. There's no way that volunteer is getting a positive reference from me, ever. Because they stole from my organization and they were fired because of it. That's also a serious enough offense that if I've documented and I've done the dismissal process properly within my organization of that volunteer, I might share that information with the potential new organization, because that is a serious offense and they might not have been arrested. There might not be no record of it, right? Yeah. So I mean, it's really going to be up to you. If Camila, and I keep picking on my staff, but if Camila, because I've worked with her for so long, if she applied for a job that I didn't think she'd be successful at, we have a relationship where I could tell her, you know what I mean? I could say to Camila, you know what, I don't know if this is going to make you, I don't know if you're going to like this job. I don't know if I can give you a positive reference for it. I might have that conversation with her because we have that established relationship. It's totally up to you. If you want to do that for a volunteer, if you want to go that extra mile, I don't see a reason why not. Like, depending on what the negative reference would be, you know?
Terry actually from the city of Winnipeg gave some good advice and said, I always tell people that I will give honest, factual references when they ask. So, you know, it's good to just be honest.
Exactly. And the beauty of sticking to the facts is they're not wrong, right? Yeah, so if you say, yes, Camila volunteered between September and August, and yes, this was the position she held, and yes, these were the outcomes of her role, and these are the statistics we reported on, like those are all facts, right? And you can share that, no problem.
So we've got one more question thus far. If there's more, please bring them to the chat, but this is one more that we've got. The question is, what would you suggest as a proper way to proceed when the position requires a background check? However, you have not received those results in time of the program start date. So for example, coaching a children's soccer team, you need a criminal record check or a background check done. However, that person hasn't received it, but the program has started.
So as an organization, you need to determine what your bottom line around that is. You need to determine, before you even start recruiting a volunteer for that position, the first step of screening is assessment. And when we talk about assessment, we talk about assessing the risk of that position and whether it's low, medium, high, what the different steps and policies around the screening are going to be based on the low, medium, or high risk of the position. So if we're talking about a high risk position, and again, you have to determine that on your own as an organization. A soccer coach within the parameters of your organization is not going to be the same position as a soccer coach within the parameters of another person's organization, right? You're going to have different ways of monitoring that progress. You're going to have different ways of running that program, et cetera. You need to look at all of that in your assessment and determine as an organization, okay, if we need screening done for these coaches, then is our bottom line absolutely no one volunteers until the record check comes back clear. And if that's your bottom line, you have to stick to it. If you are looking at a position and it's a lower risk position and there's not a lot of opportunity to take advantage or commit at that or whatever you've determined the risk is, then you might say, okay, you have to submit to a criminal record check or a child abuse check or whatever it is. And if the check doesn't come back by the time the program starts, we will allow volunteers to volunteer for us, but they must be paired with a current volunteer in order to ensure the safety of our participants. So you have to look at that as an organization. You have to decide yourselves what your bottom line is in terms of making sure the safety of your participants, your community, and your volunteer program is maintained.
Definitely. No, that was great.
Help.
So yeah,
I took a whole webinar just on police record checks, probably.
No, we really, you know what? I feel like it comes up in all the webinars, and I'm almost like, did we already do a webinar? But I think every single time we have a webinar, we just talk about them.
Yeah.
No, thank you, Dawn. That was great.
No problem.
Thank you very much, Dawn, for that fabulous webinar. It went really well, and thank you to everyone that joined us. Hope you have a great rest of your day. Oh, and here's the contact information. Perfect. You can even.
I forgot I was in charge of the slide. Sorry, guys.
Totally fine, Dawn. You can email Tracy at training@volunteermanitoba.ca, and she'll be able to pass along the questions or just answer them for you. So please don't hesitate to reach out. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.